All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class on happiness. And so we are now in the middle of the second unit of this class. We've finished our unit on a philosophical view of happiness, in which we looked at the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. And now we are in the middle of our unit on a scholastic view of happiness, in which we're diving into the Summa Theologiae by Thomas Aquinas. So I said a little bit about Thomas Aquinas last time. So, he is the leading theologian of the Middle Ages in the 13th century, and he represents the peak of the scholastic movement, which is essentially the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. You combine those elements together and you get a really deep, rigorous, thorough explanation and defense of the Christian faith and all of the doctrines that it entails. I also mentioned a website last week. If you're interested in looking at the Summa for yourself, it is available for free online at this website, newadvent.org/Summa. And I should repeat a little bit what I said last week about how to read the Summa. If you do ever intend to read Thomas Aquinas for yourself, you have to have some understanding of how he structures his argument. So each chapter or article within the Summa is organized in this format, where he begins by posing some yes or no question. And it could be on anything, like, does man have a chief end, for example? That's a question that we looked at last week. And so he will first list a series of objections to the traditional answer to that question. And then he will present the traditional answer itself, which is in the form of, it's called the sed contra, which means on the other hand. So he presents the opposing view as strongly as he can, and then he states some traditional authority that defends the traditional view. And that could be anybody like Aristotle or St. Augustine or Boethius or any number of leading church fathers or Scripture itself. And then what he does is he gives his own answer. That's the respondeo, where he will generally defend the traditional answer, but with some nuance. He'll add some categorical distinctions or explanations that will help to address the objections that are raised against the traditional answer. And then he applies his insights to each objection one by one in the concluding section of the article. So each article itself is fairly short. You could read any given article by Thomas within 5 to 10 minutes maybe. But it's extremely dense because it's assuming a knowledge of the categories that he's working with, like, Aristotelianism. So like the distinction between like form and matter, or substance and accident. There's a lot of conceptual weight behind each of those categories. And so you need to know what those concepts mean in order to make sense of his arguments, which is why Aquinas is so a bit daunting for the uninitiated. So I would recommend, if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper in this, but you're still intimidated by Thomas, go with this book, How and How Not to Be Happy by J. Budziszewski. It was published back in 2022. It is one of my all-time favorite books. I've read it maybe 3 times now. And it is wonderful. What he does is, he's a philosopher who specializes in Thomas Aquinas. And he walks you through the general argument, but he's applying like real-life applications and illustrations to make it much more understandable. And so he doesn't just assume a knowledge of these deep philosophical concepts. He kind of walks you through it with everyday illustrations and examples based on his interactions with his students in the classroom, for example. And so it's much more readable, and it's fairly concise. He did convert to Catholicism himself. If I remember right, Budziszewski was originally like an atheist, or maybe, he was an evangelical for a time, but I believe he is Roman Catholic now. But he is still one of my favorite philosophers. He became a Christian after becoming a professor there. Okay, I wasn't sure of the timeline for him. And I've seen that happen with a number of well-known Christian theologians and philosophers where they went that route. They ended up converting to Catholicism. But I think as Protestants, we can still find a lot of wisdom and insight, especially in the way they interact with Thomas Aquinas. I think a lot of Protestants today have this aversion to Thomas because he's so closely associated with Catholicism. But keep in mind, he was writing before the Reformation happened. So I would say Aquinas is just as much our guy as he belongs to the Catholics. Just like the Church Fathers. Yeah. So Sproul was very heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas. There are like internal reform debates over to what extent can we appropriate like scholastic thinking and Thomism, but Sproul himself was on the more Thomist side. And I'd consider myself on that side too. But yeah, that's one of those interesting in-house debates that Reformed theologians have among themselves. But another book that Budziszewski wrote is the one that I was using in preparation for the lessons for this unit of the class. It's his commentary on Thomas Aquinas, the section of the Summa that talks about happiness and ultimate purpose. So we have 5 core questions in this section of the Summa that we are addressing. Last week we looked at question number 1 and briefly at question number 2 towards the end. And I want to pick it up from there and cover questions 2, 3, and 4, but I'm going to change my approach just a little bit to make it a little bit more accessible. I tried to go article by article through the Summa, and that's just too overwhelming and too intimidating, and it's basically like getting hit with a fire hose. I'm still probably going to hit you with a fire hose because that's just what I do, but I'm going to try to make it a little bit more accessible. So hopefully you'll get more out of the lesson today. But I did want to recap what we talked about last week, just in case you weren't with us. This is a quote from Budziszewski's commentary where he's basically summarizing that entire first question. You may remember if you were with us last week, I posed the question, how do we know that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever? And how do we know that we even have a chief end? What is a chief end? That is really at the heart of question 1 in this section of the Summa. And here is how Budziszewski summarizes Thomas's conclusion to that. In question 1, we found that acting for a purpose is a property of man, that although subrational things also act for purposes, man does so under his own agency and direction. So like a bird forms a nest with a purpose to living in the nest. Does that mean the bird knows what it's doing? No, it's doing it by instinct. But it still has a purpose that's been implanted within it by God himself, who does know the purpose. Humans are unique, though, because we can reflect on our purposes, and we can direct our activities towards that purpose intentionally. So we are unique as human beings in that way. And that the purpose of an act makes it the kind of act that it is. So whether an act is, so for example, I use the example of like, if you were to kill somebody, is it an act of self-defense or is it an act of revenge? Well, your purpose in that action, your moral purpose, is going to define what kind of act is it. Is it murder or not? So that's what he's getting at by that sort of question. Like we categorize our activities based on what their purpose is. Furthermore, we found that each human being pursues some aim as an ultimate purpose, not just something else, but not for something else, but for its own sake. In that question, he was just establishing the point that everybody has some ultimate purpose in their life. It reminded me of, how many of you are familiar with like the 12-step program in AA? So, it's not technically a Christian program. They describe it as like each person comes to an acknowledgement, like it's the second step is where you recognize there's a higher power. But they refer to that as the God of their own choosing, right? So they recognize there is some ultimate purpose. But at that point, in this program, they're saying it's up to you to decide what that is. In this part of the Summa, Thomas is establishing that we do have some higher power. He hasn't yet established that everybody has the same ultimate purpose or higher power. He is going to do that in the next article. But that's what he's trying to do here, establish here, is that everybody has some ultimate purpose. He does then go on to establish that everybody has the same ultimate purpose. So that he pursues just one purpose as ultimate and that he directs everything to it. And finally, we found that all human beings have the same ultimate purpose, the fulfillment of which only rational beings are capable. Okay, so that is what we covered most of last week. I'm going to take it from there and move into the next 3 questions, but I'm not going to dive too deep into I want you to get a big picture understanding what he's doing with each of these questions. Question number 2, we don't have to spend a terrible amount of too much time on because we covered a lot of this in Boethius in the unit on a philosophical view of happiness, the so-called dead ends to happiness. How do we know what it is that makes us truly happy? What are the false sources of happiness, the failed candidates? And throughout the history of humanity, we've tried everything, right? We've tried to find everything other than God to make ourselves happy, and every time we find ourselves disappointed. Because all of these things that you see on this list here, wealth, honors, fame and glory, power, any bodily good, pleasure, any good of the soul, any created good whatsoever, they're not the kind of things that will bring us the ultimate fulfillment that we are designed for. The deepest longing of the human heart will not be satisfied by any created good. As it's sometimes put, every heart has a God-shaped hole. That really is at the core of Augustine's Confessions. You might be familiar with his opening prayer in his Confessions. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Thomas is explaining philosophically why that's true. Why are our hearts restless until they rest in God? Because none of these things on this list fill that God-shaped hole. Rather than giving you all the rigorous philosophical arguments for why each one of those fails, though, I want to share a story that I use with my students in my 10th grade class. How many of you have ever heard of a dialogue by Plato called Gorgias? Gorgias. It's a little dialogue. It's not one of his more popular ones. But in that dialogue, Socrates is having a conversation with several leading rhetoric teachers in Athens. And the whole dialogue revolves around the question of what is rhetoric, how is rhetoric related to justice, and how is that related to human happiness? So those three core ideas are at the heart of the dialogue in Gorgias: rhetoric, justice, and happiness. At one point in the dialogue, Socrates is having a disagreement with one of the other people present in the conversation. His name is Callicles. That's the guy on the right you see in the picture there. Callicles is a young, aspiring statesman in Athens. He has ambition to be a great politician, but they find themselves butting heads over the question of what truly makes a person happy. What is the essence of human happiness? And in the course of their debate, Socrates poses a mythological story about two different men who have these jars filled with, precious goods like milk or wine or honey. One of these men's jars is intact, and he learns to be satisfied because he has just enough of every precious good that he desires. And he learns to control his appetite so that he doesn't need more. He can be content with what he has. So Socrates is advocating moderation, self-control, and contentment. Callicles, on the other hand, says that's happiness for weaklings. The truly happy ones are the ones who have the pleasure of constantly filling up their jars. And so in the myth that Socrates tells, the other guy has leaky jars. They're broken and they're constantly needing refilling. Callicles argues that's the guy who's actually happier as long as he has the ability to keep filling up the jar. Because in Socrates' case, the man who's content with what he has misses out on the pleasure of filling up the jar. On the other hand, for Callicles, the one who keeps filling up his jar, as long as he has the ability to do so, has the pleasure of filling up, which the other guy misses out on. So Callicles represents hedonism as his view of happiness. So, the pursuit of pleasure, pursuing every desire and impulse to the maximal extent all the time. That was Callicles' understanding of happiness. Now, Callicles might remind you of a verse from Jeremiah. Do you remember what God's judgment on Judah was through the prophet Jeremiah, where he says, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and they have hewn for themselves broken cisterns that won't hold water. That's pretty much literally exactly what Callicles is advocating, isn't it? He's advocating a broken cistern view of happiness. But hey, as long as you can keep filling it up, that's what will make you happy. I want to argue, though, although Socrates is closer to the truth, in advocating virtue and self-control and moderation, I believe they're both getting at an element of truth when it comes to happiness. There is an apocryphal book, so it's not in the Protestant canon. But how many of you have ever heard of a book in the Catholic canon called Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, sometimes as it's translated? There's a verse where Lady Wisdom is giving this speech, and she says that they that eat me shall yet hunger. What does that mean? That those who partake of wisdom shall yet hunger? Well, there's a sort of hunger where you desire more, and yet you can still be satisfied with what you have. In other words, this apocryphal book, which we would not say is canon, but it is getting at a true biblical insight, I think, is saying that we can be satisfied with God and yet still delight in experiencing more of God. Whereas, in Socrates' model of happiness, you can reach a point where you say, okay, I've had enough, I don't need any more. As Christians, will we ever reach a point where we will say to God, thank you, God, but I've had enough of you, I don't need any more. I've reached my fill. We're never going to say that to God, are we? But will we be supremely satisfied in God? Yes. But how can both of those be true? How can we say that we're supremely satisfied in God and yet we'll never have enough of God? This is where early church fathers came up with a term. It's in the New Testament. The word is epictasis. This word goes back to the 4th century church father Gregory of Nyssa. Epictasis, you might remember from Philippians 3:13, where Paul says that not that I've yet reached perfection, but I press forward or I strive ahead to attain the mark. That word for pressing forward or striving forward is epictasis. And the way Gregory of Nyssa used it was to describe the Christian understanding of happiness, where to be a Christian, to be glorified in the presence of God in heaven, we will be supremely happy, and yet because God is infinite, He's an inexhaustible supply of ever greater and greater delights. You might remember, spoiler alert here, the climax of the last battle in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Do you remember after they pass through the shed, the stable, and then they find themselves in this renewed heavenly Narnia? And then there's the unicorn. What's his name? Jewel the unicorn. He's the one who looks out at the horizon and sees like these mountains and waterfalls and this beautiful vista. And they journey into it. And from that vantage point, they look beyond to the next horizon, and it is even more beautiful, even more majestic. And so the unicorn, Jewel, cries out, "Further up and further in." And they keep pressing forward into each new horizon, which they find to be more beautiful, more glorious than the last. And that will be forever. That's the Christian doctrine of happiness. That's epictasis. And so what we're doing in that Christian doctrine is basically taking the best of Socrates and Callicles. Yes, we have self-control. We need virtue for happiness. We need to be content with what God has given us. And yet in God, we will always be filling up on more. And so they're both kind of right and both kind of wrong. But Christians uniquely get that insight, that we can have both. We can kind of have our cake and eat it too here. Because God is the infinite source of happiness. We will never reach a point where we've had enough of God, and yet we will still be supremely delighted. Now, I imagine that a skeptic would consider that Christian definition of happiness, I use the word epictasis, and say, yeah, but we have no reason to think, there's nothing in the created world that's like that. There's nothing, we can look around us and say there is nothing in the universe that we can see that both supremely delights us and yet will constantly fill us up on more. And so the skeptic might say that the Christian hope is just a pie in the sky. What grounds do we have to believe that it's even true, that there is such a thing as that kind of happiness? A happiness that always fills us up but leaves us supremely delighted. This is where Aquinas makes a very similar argument to somebody else centuries later, one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. This comes from a quote from his book, Mere Christianity, where Lewis is making us, he's addressing the same problem. Like, what if we find ourselves disappointed with every creaturely good? How do we deal with that kind of disappointment, the unfulfilled longings of the human heart? And he concludes from those unfulfilled longings that our true happiness must lie elsewhere. Here's how he puts it. And you might be familiar with this quote. It's one of his most famous quotes. It's one of my favorite quotes. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for something else, the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on, that's epictasis, to that other country and to help others to do the same. Have you guys heard this quote before? It's a brilliant, a profoundly wise insight into the nature of human happiness. We have these unfulfilled longings that no creaturely good can ever satisfy. We could conclude that maybe we just haven't found the right creaturely good yet, and that would be the path of the addict or the womanizer or the miser, pursuing just more and more of whatever creaturely good they think will bring them happiness. The problem with that approach is, how many of you have ever heard the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? That's the path of insanity. On the other hand, we could just go the path of resignation and say, well, that's just the way the world is. We're never going to be satisfied with whatever we have, so we just need to get over that fact and just settle for whatever respectable life we can attain. That would be like the path of Stoicism, for example, that we just have to live the best life that we can and not let external circumstances bother us too much. Mind over matter, essentially. That would be one approach, and that is definitely a more sensible approach than insanity. But wouldn't it be tragic to find out the moment it's too late, the moment after you die, that it turned out there really was an object that would bring you that kind of satisfaction, and you turned aside from it? What if that longing itself is the evidence? As Aristotle once put it, and Thomas Aquinas repeats this, Lewis repeats this idea, nature makes nothing in vain. If there is a desire within you, there's a reason for that desire. And the desire that we have for heaven is there on purpose. You might be familiar with Ecclesiastes 3:11. God put eternity in man's heart. We have that God-shaped hole for a reason. It'd be really hard to explain that on Darwinian terms, wouldn't it? I mean, what does that God-shaped hole have to do with survival and reproduction? Where does survival of the fittest or natural selection fit into that? Why would nature select that kind of desire? Doesn't make a lot of sense. But if God created us for himself and implanted within us a desire to seek him out, then that desire makes a lot of sense. And so I think that is a signpost to the fact that God made us for him. So that's how I'm going to conclude that second question about earthly goods and why no created good can bring ultimate lasting joy. This is Aquinas' conclusion to that same question. For supreme happiness to lie in any created good is impossible. Bear in mind that happiness is the complete good that quiets all desire. Nothing that did leave something to be desired could be our ultimate purpose. But just as the intellect's target is truth as such, universal truth, so the target of the will or rational appetite is good as such, universal good. Plainly then, nothing but the universal good can quiet man's will. We find this not in any created good, but only in God. For every created thing derives its particular good only by sharing in his universal and uncreated good. For this reason, only God can fill up and satisfy man's will. This is just what the psalmist says when he describes God as the one who satisfies your desire with good. It follows that only in God is man happy. In this world, we will only find particular goods. And we can only find a limited satisfaction in each of those goods. But the will longs for the universal good, supreme good. That is true happiness. And nothing in this world will fill that desire, because it's not meant to. Moving to question 3, here is the question. Now we're trying to define what exactly is happiness and where does it actually lie. This is where it gets a little bit technical. And so I had some help with ChatGPT to make some infographics for you guys. And hopefully this is going to make it a little bit easier. This is hard. This part was hard, but I'm going to try to make it simple. This is where he's unpacking the Aristotelian philosophy of the mind. And so he's going to look at the different parts of the human soul and say, is happiness there, or is it here, or is it there? So he's going to look at the different parts of the soul to conclude, where would we find supreme happiness within the human soul? Where does the human soul make contact with God such that it will find supreme happiness? And so these are some of the questions addressed. Now, you might think with that question 1, is it something uncreated? Didn't we already establish that it's not? But that's where Aquinas makes an important distinction. God himself as the object of our happiness is uncreated. But what about our experience of that happiness? That happens in time, doesn't it? Like for us, it happens, when we're glorified, either when we die or when Jesus comes back. And so if in that sense, we can say that there is the experience of happiness exists as a created phenomenon. But it's where creation makes contact with its creator. So it's kind of like a both and. This is where we're getting into those scholastic distinctions that Aquinas loves so much. Question 2, I'm going to unpack in a bit more detail. Is it something that we feel, we have, or we do? Like, how are we supposed to define happiness itself? Do we experience it? Does it involve human activity? Is it an operation of the soul, or is it something given to us? Is it some property that we possess? And then he's going to look at how it relates to the human mind. Is happiness something sensory, or is it mental? And if it's mental, is it part of the intellectual part of the mind or the volitional part of the mind? Is it intellect or will? And if it's in the intellectual part of the mind, is it the theoretical intellect or the practical intellect? I know I'm already overwhelming you here, but I'm going to try to make it simple. And if it's in the theoretical intellect, is it in any particular scientific study? Like, can you find supreme happiness by taking a Sunday school class with Pastor Kyle? I'm just going to warn you, no. I'm sorry. This is meant to be a help on your journey to happiness, but this is not the thing itself. I'm sorry. Is it knowledge of angels? I'm just going to skip that one totally. I'm sorry. Is it knowledge of the divine essence? Spoiler alert, yes. And so what we're doing here is trying to establish that conclusion, that supreme happiness consists in knowledge of the divine essence. How do we get there? Let me back up and go with that initial question. What kind of thing is happiness? Is it something we feel, or we have, or we do? Now, to help you out here, I'm going to use some illustrations. And unfortunately, it looks like one of the pictures didn't upload, but that's okay. Do you remember last week? No, it was like 2 weeks ago. In my discussion on Boethius, where I used the story of the soldier who was on the front lines and he had a photo of his sweetheart and he was showing it to his comrades and he said, "Hey, check out my sweetheart." And like, "Oh, that's awesome. You must really miss her." And he's like, "Wait, what are you talking about? She's right here in my hand." Right? What's the problem with that soldier? He's mistaking the image for the reality. Right? And there's a category error there. There is a sense in which that photo should bring him happiness because it's a reminder of the source of his true delight, which is his beloved. But it's not the thing itself. That is very much the relationship between every creaturely good and God himself. At best, we have reflections or images of true happiness here on earth, but it's not the thing itself. And so the reason why that scenario is so ridiculous is because it shows what happens when we mistake the experience of happiness for the reality. Let me give you some other examples here too. These, I think, one of them at least I got from Budziszewski. Imagine this scenario. You're talking with a hedonist, right? Somebody who thinks that pleasure simply is the experience of pleasure is happiness, and that those are identical. Happiness equals pleasure. Well, to determine whether that's truly the case, consider this scenario. What if you subjected yourself to some medical experiment where you are strapped to a gurney, you have all your nutrients provided to you through IV fluids, and you have these electrodes attached to your brain that stimulate the pleasure center of your brain to the maximal extent for the rest of your life? By definition, you could not experience greater pleasure. That is the maximal amount of pleasure that a human being could experience on this earth. Do you think that person is supremely happy? Would you sign up for that experiment? Why not? What's missing? It's not real. You may have the experience of supreme pleasure, but it's a lie, right? It's electrodes stimulating your brain. It doesn't matter how pleasant it feels. It's not reality. And that kind of sets us up for this next one. How many of you are familiar with the old movie Stepford Wives? Which I think they remade 15, 20 years ago. I think Matthew Broderick was in it too, if I remember right. But in the movie, as I recall, the wives are like robots, aren't they? But they are the perfect wife, right? They do whatever the husband wants. They cater to his every whim. They cook, they clean, they never complain. They are totally devoted and faithful to him. Wouldn't that be the happiest marriage? What if your spouse did all that for you? What's missing? It's fake, right? The problem is it's based on a lie. That's not a human being. What we're doing, this is what happens when we separate the experience of happiness from the reality. In all these cases, what we're showing is that there must be more to happiness than just a feeling. So consider your own marriage, right? Like, think about the happiness that you have in your own marriage. I would say that I love my wife not because she brings me delight, but because I know her. And that brings me delight. That's what a true marriage is. It's about truly knowing your spouse. And that should bring delight. But when the delight itself is the goal, you're missing the point. That's the same when it comes to happiness in God. We should love God for who He is, and that will bring delight. But if we're seeking the delight as our chief end, we're going to miss the thing itself. Right. I think it's settling for that as your ultimate good. Right. That's where the problem comes in. It's I'm not saying like, there's no value to like lesser goods or, these temporary pleasures or whatever. Like as long as they're morally permissible, they have an appropriate place in our lives. Like if you have a robotic pet, that's weird. But I mean, yes, I don't see that as morally problematic, right? But the issue comes when you think it is the supreme fulfillment. And so when it's a substitute for real relationship, true knowledge. And so, let's see, let me move forward here. Looks like, too bad. There was an image that I was going to show you that kind of summarized the entire, it didn't upload. I'm so sorry. That was my summary of the entire question 2 that showed you like that ChatGPT flow chart that explained all the different parts of the human mind. But let me just kind of conclude that part then. Aquinas argues that true happiness does not lie in our will, it must lie in our intellect. Now, think of the will, that's the choosing part of your brain. The intellect is the knowing part of your brain. They're both parts of the human soul, but they have different functions. But the will follows the lead of the intellect, right? The will can only desire something as good if it's first presented as an object of knowledge by the intellect. Because you can only evaluate something as good or bad if you know what it is. I'm reminded of that song by The Doors. You guys know that song like, "Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name?" Yeah. Is that real love? Can you really love somebody if you don't even know their name? No. Okay, so take that same point, right? You have to have knowledge of an object in order to truly love it. And that's why we have to say that the supreme object of happiness must lie first in the intellect, and the will follow. But it's supremely in the intellect. And so Aquinas is going to use arguments like that to show that ultimately the only thing that will bring supreme happiness is a true knowledge of the divine essence, to know what God actually is.
So we can actually love the object you didn't show us because we can understand it?
Right, there we go. Hopefully, if I've explained it clearly enough. Yeah, so I saw, I don't know what happened, but as I was creating the slides on my laptop, I saw the loading circle going over and over, but it was, the entire week it was up there. And so I'm thinking, okay, surely it's uploaded by now. I should have checked beforehand though, but alas, maybe I'll just, I'm going to be gone next week. I'll show it at some point. It's really cool. Just trust me. Take my word for it. Intellectually, you love it, right? The essence of that image is, yeah. All right. Anyway, moving forward. It's not critical. It'll save us time. Let's talk about the beatific vision itself, which comes at the conclusion of question 3, where Aquinas is defining this is what true happiness must be. It is the fulfillment of the highest power of that thing which makes us uniquely human. It cannot be a sensory delight because humans are higher than the animals. And our fulfillment, our greatest fulfillment, can't simply be what fulfills the animals. It must be the fulfillment of that part of us that is what makes us greatest, what makes us highest. So the highest object of the highest power that humans possess would be the knowledge, within our mind, the knowledge of the divine essence. That is the supreme object of contemplation for our minds. And here's how Aquinas defends that argument, that supreme happiness must be in knowledge of the divine essence, which theologians have often called the beatific vision, the blessed sight of God himself, seeing God face to face. So you might be familiar with the Beatitude, where Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That's the beatific vision. That's what Aquinas is defending right here. He says complete and ultimate happiness can be nothing but the vision of God's essence. 2 considerations show why this is true. One is that the nature of a power's fulfillment depends on the nature of its object, on the thing at which it aims. The other is that so long as there is still something for man to long and strive for, he is not perfectly happy. So we've kind of already touched on that point. Like whatever object it is that brings us happiness, if it leaves something else to be desired, it's not the supreme object of happiness. Because by definition, the thing that makes us supremely happy would leave nothing left over to be desired. And so whatever that thing is must be the object of our supreme happiness. And it must also be the greatest object to fulfill the greatest power within us. So if our greatest power as human beings, the thing that makes us unique as humans is our mind, our rational will, or our rational intellect, what object could supremely fulfill that? What would be the greatest possible object of knowledge? Well, it should be that which made us, right? The thing that we are made for, the thing that gives us purpose. Well, what's that? It is God himself. But it's not enough simply to know that there is a God. It's not simply enough to know that God must be the logical cause of all the effects that we see in the world. To look at the intelligent design of the universe and conclude there must be a designer behind it, or there must be a first cause or an unmoved mover. Those are good logical arguments, and Aquinas uses those all the time. We've already looked at some last week. But that's not to know God. There's a difference between knowing that there is a God and knowing what he is or knowing who he is. It's knowledge of who God is that will bring a supreme happiness. So here's how Thomas continues. What then is the target of the intellect? Its target is what things really are, their essences. So we're making a distinction here between essence and existence. You can know that a thing exists without knowing what it actually is. Now, if the intellect knows only the essence of a thing's effect, this is not enough to show the essence of the thing itself. It cannot provide understanding of what the thing is as a cause. Although from such knowledge the intellect may be able to work out the fact that the cause is, it cannot be said simply to reach the cause. So even if a man knows an effect and knows that it has a cause, he still has a natural longing to know what that cause is. And this is the basis of all human knowledge. All knowledge begins in wonder. We want to know. That longing to know is what we call wonder, which spurs us to delve further into things. For example, someone who knows a solar eclipse and knows that something is causing it, but does not know what that cause is, marvels and tries to find out. He will not stop until he does find out, until he attains an understanding of what the cause is, of its essence. We look at a mysterious world around us and we're filled with a sense of wonder and we want to know. That longing to know is what propels us to seek knowledge. And when we attain that knowledge, the mind can rest. We have satisfaction in knowing that we now possess in our mind the object of our wonder. So it is that if the human intellect, working things out from the essence of some effect that God creates, knows nothing of him, but that he is, then it has not yet reached all the way to the first cause. And it still naturally longs to seek it out. And so it is not yet completely happy. For the perfection of happiness, the intellect does not need to reach all the way. It must touch the very being of the Creator, as we have been saying for some time. It attains this perfection by union with God, to whom it is directed. Here and nowhere else lies man's happiness. So, let me see here. Let me say a little bit also about question 4 as I wrap this up. I'm just going to touch on this question briefly. And then Byron next week is going to dive deeper into the final question, which is how do we actually attain supreme happiness? But here, I want to talk about what Aquinas has to say about the requirements of happiness. Exactly what are those things that are necessary for us to attain happiness? And so let me just touch on each one of these briefly, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So, would we say that happiness requires delight? Can we possess happiness if we don't possess delight? So Aquinas would say there is a sense in which delight is necessary as long as we don't confuse happiness with delight itself. Right? So, like I said, I love my wife not because she brings me delight, but I love my wife because I know her, and that knowledge does bring me delight, and necessarily so. In the same way, if you can see who God really is and not have supreme delight in him, something's wrong with you. Because he is the supremely delightful object. And so what Aquinas does to answer that question, he is going to argue that there is a sense in which happiness requires delight. But we can talk about something being required in at least one of four ways. Something could be required as preparation, for example, as study is to a particular scientific field. It could be required as the completion of something, such as the soul is the completion of the body. It could be required as like an external aid. Like think of like Frodo seeking to destroy the Ring of Power in Mount Doom. He needed friends to help him along the way, right? He needed Sam. And so that's an external aid is necessary. There's a fourth kind of requirement, though, which is what Aquinas describes as a concomitant or a necessary accompaniment, such as heat to fire, or the delight that I have in knowing my wife. It is a necessary accompaniment, right? It's a necessary entailment of that good. And in that sense, we can say that delight is required in happiness. It's not the same thing, but it will necessarily be entailed by the possession of the thing that does bring us happiness. So yes, we will be supremely delighted in God, but the delight itself is not the thing we're after. It's God, which brings us delight when we have him. Is delight greater than vision? Well, I think we've already established that it can't be because, like I said, like we love someone not for the pleasure they bring us, but because we know them. So to see God face to face is the greatest thing, which brings us delight. Now, does it require comprehending God? Well, here we got to make a distinction. As creatures, will we ever have an infinite knowledge of God? Will we have a perfect knowledge of God according to our mode as creatures? Like to know God to the maximal extent that we can as creatures. At any given time, I suppose you could say. In that sense, yes, there is a perfection to our knowledge of God, but it's also a perfection that can paradoxically continue to grow. Remember epictasis, further up and further in? We can continue to infinitely grow in our knowledge of God, and yet at any given moment, we'll possess a perfect knowledge at that time. Right? Think of like a cup that is completely full of wine, but the cup itself grows and grows over time, and so it can be filled up with more and more wine. That's what it's going to be like for us to experience delight in God. We will be perfectly full with God, but we'll be filling up more because he will expand our capacity to know him infinitely, because he's an inexhaustible supply of joy. Does it require rectitude of will, or does it require us to be righteous? Yes and no, and this is where, there's, again, we have to take into consideration how we describe, the requirements. There is a antecedent requirement for righteousness or holiness. You guys remember that passage from Hebrews that says, without holiness, no one will see God? So we could say, yes, there is a sense in which holiness is necessary, rectitude of will is necessary, but there's also the gift element, right? Like as Protestants, we would say we receive righteousness from God as a gift. But could God bring somebody who's not declared righteous into his presence to experience this beatific vision? No. We cannot comprehend or know God as he is without that righteousness. Because to know God as he truly is to love God. You cannot see God as he truly is and not love him. But to love God as he truly is, to perfectly love God, by necessity means we have all of our loves rightly ordered. If our loves were disordered, we would not be rightly loving God, and therefore we would not be rightly knowing God. And so that's why there is a sense in which it's necessary. Here's an interesting question, though. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is it necessary for human happiness to have physical bodies to experience perfect happiness in God? I found out that Thomas actually changed his mind on this question over the years. What do you guys think? Do we have to have bodies in order to experience supreme human happiness? I mean, it is part of human nature to have a body, right? I mean, you would think that, if we didn't need our bodies, why would there be a final resurrection at all? Why not just keep us in that intermediate state, right? As disembodied souls for all eternity. If that's all that's necessary for perfect happiness, why not just stop there? Why add bodies to it? It turns out that this question has more objections than any other article in this section of the Summa, because he really wrestled with this question. But interestingly, he concludes that our bodies are not required for happiness. With a catch. Again, scholastic distinctions here. We have to say yes and no. But here's what he means when he says that. He would say that happiness does not require bodies. And on one hand, he's going to make like an Aristotelian argument based on how a body relates to human knowledge. Because remember what we've just established. Supreme happiness consists in knowledge of the divine essence. Do you need a body to have that kind of knowledge? Well, in fact, it turns out no, if we're going by Aristotelian categories. Think about how we know anything in the world right now as human beings on this earth. We actually possess all the knowledge we have by means of our bodies. Because think about it. We have to receive sensory input to know anything, right? To know, do you remember a few weeks ago I used the concept of tigerness? You can't know the concept of tigerness unless you've seen a tiger, or at least seen it on the pages of a book, right? So, in order to have any kind of mental category, we need sensory input. So our bodies are necessary for knowledge of earthly things. Because what happens is we take it in via our senses, and that's processed through our rationality, and that's abstracted into these concepts that we can reflect on rationally. That's just how human knowledge works. But God is different. Because God is not a creature. He's not embodied. He doesn't exist within time and space. He's the one thing that we could not know through our bodies. Because everything we know through our bodies... Do you remember I used the word phantasm a few weeks ago? Like I said, think of a tiger. Close your eyes and think of a tiger. That mental image that you have of a tiger, it's stored in your memory because of prior sense experience. All knowledge that we have in earthly life is based on phantasms, according to Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. But God is the one thing that can't be known via phantasms because his essence is not expressed visibly or physically. And so, in that Aristotelian sense, we cannot know God via our bodies. In that sense, knowledge of God does not require our bodies. It's not even possible to know God through our bodies. That's one argument that Aquinas gives. He also argues he also argues that angels are capable of knowing God's essence without bodies, and therefore it would follow for us as well in the intermediate state. Even we know that, based on the book of Revelation, believers see God face to face before the resurrection. And they have that supreme consolation, that supreme comfort in seeing God face to face even in heaven. So it is at least possible, but then why do bodies come into it at all? Here is the argument that Aquinas makes, and I can simplify it into one word: overflow. It's not that possessing bodies will add to our experience. Well, it's not that it will intensify our experience of happiness, because we will have supreme happiness in God even without the body. But our bodies will add to it in a sort of overflow. And I can use an analogy here to make this make sense. Think about God's own happiness. Does he add to his happiness by creating the world? Or is he already supremely happy? He is already supremely happy, right? But is there a sense in which divine happiness increases because of creation? Well, in a certain sense, that there are more people who can experience that divine happiness. But what the way Aquinas would put it is God's happiness does not increase intensively, it increases extensively. Right? He is perfectly happy in himself, but now there are more people to enjoy that happiness with him. In the same way, having bodies will allow that supreme happiness to overflow, like the cup runneth over, right, to our bodies. So that we will have perfect happiness in our souls, but as sort of a bonus, our bodies will partake of that supreme happiness in a bodily way as well. That's essentially how Thomas resolved that question of what role do bodies play in human happiness. Yes, there is a way in which they add to it, but not by making us more happy, but by extending it into the physical realm. In the same way, that's kind of how he addresses that last question there too. Does it require friends? Will we need to know our friends and loved ones in heaven to be supremely happy? No, not exactly, because we'll be supremely happy in just knowing God himself, but there will be an overflow of that happiness in being able to share that delight with those that we love and know in heaven. And so it's not that we'll be missing out on some happiness because, friends or loved ones are not there, but it's sort of like the facets of a diamond. It will add an additional sparkle to the supreme divine happiness that we have in heaven. And that's it. That was my attempt. I could have gone way deeper on this, by the way. So if you're feeling overwhelmed at this point, it could have been worse. So take comfort in that. But, okay, a couple things I want to leave you with. Just keep in mind, Thomas Aquinas is about as rigorous as this class is going to get, right? So it's all downhill from here. So don't worry about that. But I should also say, as I started reading the next book in preparation for this class, it's God and the Art of Happiness by Ellen Cherry. She does look at Aquinas' view, and she does point out that Aquinas is correct. The supreme happiness does consist in the beatific vision, knowing God's essence directly. But what about happiness right now? Does the Bible have anything to say about us possessing happiness right now? Yes, it does. And in fact, Aquinas does too. It's sort of like a secondary note woven into his treatment of supreme happiness, because the real focus is on perfect happiness in the beatific vision. But that's a more eschatological understanding of happiness, end times. But what about now? What does it mean for us Christians to experience happiness now? To what extent can we experience it now? We can. And we do need to address that question, and we will address that question after I get back from Italy. So we're going somewhere. There's more to learn in this class, and I hope you're looking forward to more, but I'm laying some of the deeper foundations right now so that we can build upon that later in this class. So any final questions? Hearing none, can I close this in prayer? All right. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your goodness. We thank you for the truth that you have made us for yourself, and that our hearts can rest in you. By faith in your Son, Jesus, you promise to us eternal joy in knowing you face to face. And so I pray, Lord, that we would hold on to that hope and trust that whatever earthly circumstances we go through, we have a supreme reward awaiting us, which is to see you face to face. And I pray that that truth would animate us and embolden us and encourage us at all times. And so we do thank you, Lord, for this class where we have an opportunity to explore the nature of true happiness. And I pray, God, that it would have relevance for our lives, that we would be reminded of these truths during the difficulties of life, during arguments with loved ones, during disappointments at work. Whatever that case may be, we are still destined for supreme happiness. Help us to keep our eyes fixed on you and fixed on that truth. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.